Hey y'all, it's entry number 44 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on Joe Mixon, running back, Cincinnati Bengals. We'll start with the positives with Joe Mixon's fantasy profile. Bell cow workload. Joe Mixon saw 334 touches last season, which was the third most among running backs during the 2021 season according to StatMuse, and has averaged 19.3 touches per game over the course of his career according to Pro Football Reference. Not many backs are capable of seeing this kind of workload, which makes Mixon a more intriguing bet in fantasy leagues. The next thing I really like about Joe Mixon's fantasy profile is his improved offensive line. The Bengals' offensive line was below average and ranked 20th at the end of the 2021 season according to Pro Football Focus. But the Cincinnati Bengals made some moves to improve their line this offseason. Going into the 2022 season, they are ranked 8th according to Pro Football Focus. This is by far the best offensive line of Mixon's career on paper. And by having a great offensive line, it seems likely that Mixon should be able to be more efficient than he's been in the past. The third thing I really like about Joe Mixon's fantasy profile is that he plays in the Bengals offense. The Cincinnati Bengals are looking like one of the most explosive offenses on paper going into the 2022 season, with no major weaknesses in their starting lineup. They were already an above-average offense last year, as they ranked 13th in total yards per game and 7th in points per game according to ESPN. By playing in an above-average offense, Joe Mixon will have plenty of opportunities to get yards and score. Moving on to some of the concerns with Joe Mixon's fantasy profile. Injury struggles. Joe Mixon has dealt with a variety of injuries over the course of his NFL career. A concussion, a knee tear, a leg shin bruise, a foot sprain, and multiple ankle sprains according to Draft Sharks. He has played in 66 of a possible 81 career regular season games, and only played in every single game of the season once, back in 2019. Based on this information, it seems there's a good chance that Mixon misses at least a game or two in 2022. The next concern I have with Joe Mixon's fantasy profile is his mediocre efficiency. Joe Mixon has averaged 4.1 yards per carry over the course of his career, which is fairly mediocre, and has 2 seasons in his career where he averaged 3.6 yards per carry or lower, back in 2017 and 2020 according to Pro Football Reference. Looking specifically at 2021, he averaged just 4.0 true yards per carry, the 42nd best among running backs, 4.5 yards per touch, the 34th best among running backs, and 2.31 yards created per touch, the 35th best among running backs according to Player Profiler. Being more mediocre in terms of efficiency could spell trouble if for some reason Mixon's volume drops off. The last concern I have with Joe Mixon's fantasy profile is his mediocre target share. Let me start by saying that Joe Mixon's receiving usage isn't bad, it's just a little more mediocre for a top-tier fantasy back. His target share of 9.4% ranked just 25th among running backs, and his 48 targets ranked just 28th among running backs according to Player Profiler. Some additional thoughts on Joe Mixon's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, Joe Mixon finished as the RB3 in standard, with 245.9 total fantasy points and 15.4 fantasy points per game, the RB3 in half PPR formats, with 266.9 total fantasy points and 16.7 fantasy points per game, and the RB4 in full PPR formats, with 287.9 total fantasy points and 18.0 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. In half PPR formats, during the 2021 season, Joe Mixon had 0 out of 16 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 5 out of 16 games with 5 to 9.9 fantasy points, 4 out of 16 games with 10 to 15 fantasy points, 0 out of 16 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, 4 out of 16 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points, 2 out of 16 games with 25 to 30 fantasy points, and 1 out of 16 games with over 30 fantasy points according to fantasy data. Zach Taylor has been a little below average in featuring his running back room as a whole, but because he generally goes with a bell cow approach on the ground, it's less noticeable in fantasy. Personal opinion. Joe Mixon is currently going off the board as RB7, about pick 14 overall on ESPN, and RB7 on Yahoo. This is the right spot for him, as he seems like one of the safer running back picks this year, as he's a bell cow, has a proven track record on a fantasy points per game basis, has an improved offensive line, plays in a strong offense, as well as many other factors. The only real way I've seen him flat out busting is due to an injury, which admittedly is a big concern with Mixon. He doesn't have quite the upside of the top 5 or so backs generally going ahead of him, but the bottom line is that he should be a reliable building block for fantasy teams in 2022. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. Joe Mixon's My Cause My Cleats in 2021 was for 2 organizations, Cancer Kids, SJC, and the Headstrong Foundation. Here's some links to those organizations below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.